Hey guys, it's the Faceless Beanie and welcome to my Sevagoth guide where I'll go over his abilities, some synergies, and show you a couple of builds as well. Let's get into it. Starting off with Sevagoth's passive. When Sevagoth is downed and enters Bleed Out, you get to control his shadow. Killing 5 enemies with the shadow quickly will revive you for free. If you don't kill 5 enemies within the limited time frame, then of course you will die. Sevagoth's shadow and his exalted weapon both have their own unique stats, properties and loadouts, which means they can be modded for completely separate from Sevagoth. His first ability, Reap, causes his shadow to fly out in the direction of his aiming reticle, and any enemy affected by the shadow receives radiation damage as well as a damage vulnerability buff for damage from all sources for a limited time. The shadow's direction can be controlled by aiming down sights, and it will automatically disappear once the ability duration runs out. You can recast this at any time. Energy cost is affected by ability efficiency, the damage vulnerability buff is affected by ability strength, duration is affected by ability duration, and radius is affected by ability range. Let's move on to So. So leaves nearby enemies within a limited radius surrounded by shadows which deal a certain amount of true damage per second for a limited time. Once you cast So, you can't recast it until either every enemy affected dies or the ability duration runs out. Energy cost is affected by ability efficiency, true damage is affected by ability strength, duration is affected by ability duration, and radius is affected by ability range. Let's move on to his third ability, Gloom. Casting Gloom summons a radial pulse wave around Sevagoth. This radial wave slowly expands to a maximum range and tracks Sevagoth instead of the spot it's casted at. Enemies within this wave will experience reduced action speed up to a maximum of 95% at 272% ability strength. Sevagoth and all his allies will gain lifesteal for all damage dealt to affected enemies. Gloom stays active for as long as you have energy, and it drains a specified amount of energy per second in addition to energy required to cast the ability in the first place. You can deactivate it at any time. While Gloom is active, you can only replenish energy from energy orbs and mods like Hunter Adrenaline. Xenoric Dash and Energy Pizzas won't work. Reduced action speed and lifesteal are both affected by ability strength. Energy drained per second and rate of expansion of the wave are both affected by ability duration, and maximum range is affected by ability range. Important to note that initial cast cost of the ability is affected by ability efficiency, but energy drained per second from then on is affected by both ability efficiency and ability duration. Now we move on to his fourth ability, which has its own abilities, Exalted Shadow. Every ability mentioned so far contributes to the death well. Using Sevagoth's other abilities to affect and kill enemies makes the death well fill up, and once it hits 75%, you can activate Exalted Shadow and take control of Sevagoth's shadow equipped with the exalted weapon Shadow Claws. Shadow's first ability, Embrace, pulls in enemies within a certain range in a cluster towards Sevagoth's shadow. These enemies are lifted and can't attack or move. The ability is casted at an 80-degree angle from the aiming reticle, so casting accuracy is important. Energy cost is affected by ability efficiency, duration is affected by ability duration, and range is affected by ability range. You can't increase the angle of the pull with mods. Next, Consume. This is mainly a healing ability. Shadow bursts forward and inflicts radiation damage towards the targeted enemy while healing himself for a certain percentage of damage dealt. Energy cost is affected by ability efficiency, damage and heal are affected by ability strength, and range is affected by ability range. Moving on to Death Harvest. This is very similar to Sevagoth's Reap. Nearby enemies are affected by shadows, which cause them to receive a damage vulnerability buff from all sources for a limited time. Energy cost is affected by ability efficiency, the damage vulnerability buff is affected by ability strength, duration is affected by ability duration, and range is affected by ability range. Using Sevagoth's shadow will slowly bring down the death well. Once it's depleted, you'll automatically transfer back to Sevagoth's original form. You can also transfer back at any time manually. The death well will be at the same level when you transfer back to Sevagoth. If you die while in Sevagoth's shadow form, you'll also be transferred back to Sevagoth immediately, and the same goes for spoiler mode. Just to quickly note, as you may know, when you die and go into Sevagoth's shadow form, you have a limited time to kill 5 enemies, otherwise you really die. And when this happens and you revive, your death well will reset. Also, after Sevagoth dies and you enter Sevagoth's shadow, you can kill the 5 enemies required by simply using the consume ability for free. It'll one-hit any non-boss enemy. Alright, let's get into some simple synergies. The most obvious one is the nuke potential of this Warframe. As their names might suggest, Reap and Sow are meant to be used together. Casting Reap on enemies affected by Sow increases damage dealt based on the health of the enemy, which means this is a scaling nuke. To get the most out of it though, it's best to prime enemies with viral procs to maximize damage. This allows for quickly clearing groups of enemies and is relatively cheap energy wise as well, while also almost always filling up your death well. You can use Sevagoth's Shadow to synergize with the nuke as well if you lack range. Get into Shadow and use his Embrace ability to pull enemies in, then get out and nuke them. You can use Reap on its own just for its damage vulnerability buff as well if you want to buff weapon damage instead. This isn't optimal, but it's an alternative use for Reap. Then for Gloom, you want this to be active at all times where possible. Its lifesteal helps Sevagoth stay alive, while the slow is a great crowd control tool depending on the situation. This ability also allows you to passively fill up the death well. Another thing about Gloom is that it stays active even while you're in Sevagoth's shadow form, so you can activate Gloom with Sevagoth, then go into shadow form and still enjoy its benefits. Of course, Sevagoth will continue to drain energy while Gloom is active even if you're using shadow. Finally, while Sevagoth and his shadow are modded for separately, ability strength on Sevagoth does affect his exalted weapon, the Shadow Claws, so if you intend to mainly use Sevagoth's shadow, some strength is a good idea. Let's move on to the builds and some practical gameplay. Now, Sevagoth is not a cheap Warframe to build and requires significant Forma investment, but it does eventually pay off. However, across him, his shadow and his claws, you're likely to be spending 12 Forma or more, so keep that in mind. The first build is built mainly with his shadow in mind, costing 4 Forma. You'll be using Sevagoth as a caster to fill up the well, then switch to the shadow. The build is fairly balanced with a slight emphasis towards strength since it has a direct impact on Shadow Claws and helps out with Gloom slow and your nuke damage as well. Growing power makes sense because you're likely to be using a status primer for your first few nukes. Rolling guard is the survivability of choice here simply because it fits the caster playstyle of the build. You won't stay in Sevagoth for too long and rolling guard will keep you alive while you do. And of course, for a cheaper build, you can use the non-primed versions of the mods used and replace Umbral Intensify with regular Intensify, although the additional strength does help keep enemies significantly slower. For the Arcanes, Energize is essential, but Graze is not. Arcane Guardian or Arcane Aegis are better picks for this slot. I don't have them, so I'm sticking with Grace. For his shadow, this 4 Forma build focuses on range and strength for Embrace's pull and consumes health restore respectively. Preparation is neat to have as it ensures you spawn into shadow with a load of energy from the get-go. For the Arcanes, Arcane Strike is pretty essential as it buffs your claws' attack speed and makes them much more effective. Energize to ensure you never run out of energy, because if you do, you're going right back to Sevagoth. For his claws, you can either build a standard condition overload build with viral and heat like this, or you can opt for a heavy attack oriented build like this. Either will work just fine and it's down to personal preference. So typically with this build, you'd start by casting Gloom. Remember to keep Gloom active at all times. This is your best form of survival. Then nuke enemies to fill up your death well, fill it up, get into shadow, use Shadow's Embrace to get enemies towards you, and keep killing them. Remember to cast Embrace properly as the 80-degree angle can be a burden sometimes. So the next 2 builds don't require Sevagoth's Shadow aside from survivability purposes. First, a 4 Forma nuke oriented build which focuses mainly on priming enemies with viral, then repeatedly casting 2 and 1 to blow them up. Your only form of survivability here is Gloom slow and lifesteal along with switching to spoiler mode and Sevagoth's Shadow. So it's not viable for the steal path necessarily, but it's good fun to nuke everything else on the star chart. Pretty standard gameplay for this. Use the 1-2 combo to nuke enemies after priming them with viral with the Kuva Nuke or any other status primer. Finally, this 4-former build is for interceptions and mobile defense missions utilizing Gloom's slow. It maxes out Gloom's 95% slow with energy conversion, requiring you to kill a few enemies beforehand to pick up an energy orb. Rolling guard keeps you alive even in the steel path as you kill enemies around you. Start off missions with Zenuric Dash or an energy pizza to fill up your energy, then keep Gloom active and kill enemies around you while dodging to activate rolling guard. Remember, you need energy orbs from enemies to keep Gloom active. That's about it. I hope this helped you out. This is the Faceless Beanie, signing out.